Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/ShelbyForsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hi there, grief growers, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Grief Book Roundup. A little while ago, one of my Patreon supporters suggested that I read the book from scratch, and I am so gloriously happy that I did. The sensory adventure that is this vibrant memoir ranges from cool and astringent to hot and searing, and culinary metaphors abound. They are all over the place in this book. Tembi Locke's humor and love and heartbreak and growth surrounding the death of her beloved husband Sado are cataloged through intimate portraits of 3 summers, as Locke companions her grief through the United States, through Italy, and beyond. Something I especially love about From Scratch is the fact that Locke is not afraid to talk about the concept or the phenomenon of body grief, the aching loss of touch and the loss of sex after her husband's death. This is something that a lot of memoirs on widowhood either bypass over or cover just a little bit. And this is one that comes up over and over and over again, is this aching grief of, I miss touching and interacting with my husband and his body. I miss eating his food. I miss kissing him. I miss making love to him. And this is something that From Scratch does not turn away from, but actually turns towards. And it was very refreshing to read in a memoir. And all in all, as a complete and total picture, From Scratch is a delight to read. And for what it's worth, it's an even bigger delight to listen to, because the audiobook features Tembi Locke narrating her work in both English and Italian. If I had to pick 3 words to describe this book, they would be warm, because the tone of Tembi Locke's voice, I did listen to the audiobook, is so inviting and personable and friendly. She really gets you an up-close, intimate portrait to the inner workings of her brain. So times when she might be jealous or irrational or angry at something in the loss of Sado, but also her joy, her very deep and searing heart of love for her daughter and her family. The next word I'd pick to describe the book is complex, because if you haven't picked up on this already, this book is an adventure of an emotional experience. This book takes you from, this is our love story, this is how we met, all the way to, and then beyond, this is the day he died. It's not so much a roller coaster as it is this meandering and traversing trip through. These are all of the things and the experiences that make up a life, that make up a relationship and a partnership and a family. And adventurous because, of course, Tembi Locke, Sado, their daughter Zoella, everyone is gallivanting and catapulting themselves around the globe, from the US to Italy, beyond, to make meaning of their lives and to find significance and power within the course of their grief stories. To give you an overview of what losses are included in this book, of course, the loss of a spouse is the foundational grief on which all the other losses sit in From Scratch. But Locke takes great care to recognize that she is not the only person grieving the death of her husband. In passages considering her new identity as a widow, you will notice Tembi Locke's reflection upon widowhood both through her own eyes and through the eyes of her Sicilian mother-in-law, who has also been widowed in her life. She also grieves on behalf of her daughter Zoella, who Locke is very aware will grieve in different ways and for different reasons as she grows up in a future without her father physically present. Also covered in From Scratch is the grief of racism, especially as it pertains to Tembi Locke's marriage as a black woman to her Sicilian husband, who is white, presenting and passing, the grief of family estrangement, the grief of the adoption process, and the similarities and differences between grief, rites, and rituals in the United States and in Sicily. I'd love to share some of my favorite quotes from the book, but of course I will reiterate that these are so incredibly good when heard in Tembi Locke's own voice through the audiobook. The first quote I'd like to share is from Part 2, First Summer, and the chapter is named Bitter Almonds. And in this chapter, Tembi Locke is sitting outside shelling almonds that have just been harvested with her mother-in-law, Croce. She writes, "Amaro, bitter, is the one flavor profile that is at the epicenter of Sicilian culture and cuisine. It is a flavor foraged for in wild greens. It is distilled into liqueur. With Amaro, Sicilians get intimate with nature's lack of sweetness. They get up close to its marked intensity. In the kitchen, when Sicilians juxtapose something Amaro with something dolce, sweet, they bring the contrasting flavors to life, make a stage for both, side by side. Bitterness, Sicilians understand, is an essential flavor both in food and in life. It has shaped the island's culinary identity. There is no sweet without bitter." The next quote I really love in From Scratch comes from Part 3, Second Summer, and the chapter is called Heirlooms. "Instead, I had come to think of my grief as a character in my life, something I had to get to know, befriend, make peace with, because it was bigger than anything I had ever known. It pulled me down and sometimes propelled me forward." And I love these two quotes together because they're such tiny snippets of what From Scratch is as a whole. It's this beautiful and intimate metaphorical storytelling about food and its relationship to grief, especially as it relates to Sicilian and Italian culture. But then also, it's about integrating grief with the whole of life, as if grief is being applied carefully, considerately, consistently to a lifelong recipe. I really hope you'll pick up From Scratch, this beautiful memoir on the loss of a husband, but so much more. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.